welcome. We left the previous episode talking about compassion and true compassion. So true compassion is where Eckhart mentioned you're still connected to the joy of being, as well as experiencing perhaps the emotion of perhaps sadness or sympathy. And this goes to or points to the non-polarity of the now. We are always rooted in the unchanging. In the ever stable present moment. And there was the analogy taken of the lake, where the surface of the lake was turbulent or ever changing, and then deep down in the lake there was the undisturbed, there was the still water. And I thought about mentioning this that I was about to talk about, but I was in two minds whether to talk about it or not. But in this moment, it feels it's what's coming up to the surface. There was the recent incident in America of a black man being, I believe he was shot by white supremacists. And I don't know the full details, or just names, but I know the essence, where there may have been a long period where there was no arrest made, and then until this was brought to public attention, then the people involved were arrested. And the reasoning I'm mentioning this is because quite recently I experienced some potential racist abuse as well. And I say potentially because I was unsure of what was shouted across the street. And as I've mentioned, I've been a bit unwell as of late, and so it's even, my mind's even, having the thought, did that person actually shout something? So I was walking quite locally to where I'm staying, and I heard someone shout what I thought was a racist slur. So I looked across the street and saw an individual there looking right at me. And I looked at them, and then the bus they were waiting to catch was only a few meters away, and I was wondering if they were trying to do that, they purposely did it so they can get on the bus and quickly make their escape. But maybe they weren't. Maybe they weren't. What they shouted wasn't that, and it was just a coincidence that the bus was there as well. In some ways, it doesn't matter, because who was there to be offended? to take the worst case scenario that they were shouting a racist slur. On one level, there's importance there in regards to perhaps gauging or being reminded of the levels of unconsciousness that are, that are here, that are among us, and even the example of the murder of the I think he may have been a young person, a young black person in America, jogging. And it shows the power of a thought. And this is by no means to diminish any of these incidents, but if you look deeper into them, it's unconsciousness. These things are taught. A thought is given to the mind, and it's over and over. And then you give it attention, so it proliferates and grows. It shows just the power of the thought, where you can not know anything about somebody but have that level of hate inside of you. You take the instance in America. In order for that to happen, there needs to be a great deal of emotion behind that, a belief, a thought. I recently listened to a podcast on this, an individual who goes to KKK rallies and speaks to individuals there. And his goal is not to convert them out of that, but the goal is to challenge what they're saying and get them to make sense of it. And through those conversations, the other person realizes that all of their thoughts that they've gathered and held on to, they're unable to hold on to them. Or perhaps they're seen through for what they are. Oh, that was just somebody's idea. To have this belief about this particular race or that race, and there's almost a transcendence happening there. And a transparency also, where they are almost, it's not now a white or black, or it's seeing the human being, seeing the beingness. And there's no belief or thought, there's a knowing, there's a connectedness there. So perhaps through the conversations this person had with the members of various white supremacist groups, perhaps there was a direct experience of some form of connection, maybe even love on some level. And that is so much more powerful than just a thought. But a thought believed in also has its own power, but it doesn't compare to the power of consciousness. And power meaning not egoic power over somebody else, but power in regards to freedom, liberation, understanding, knowing of who you truly are. So in my situation, when this person very likely said what they said, I felt a little bit confused. I was almost a bit curious. I wonder what's inside them to say that. But perhaps I sensed some sort of fear in them. It was said out of fear. One of the fears from these white supremacist groups is losing their race. And this is what was talked about in the podcast I listened to. And we know about fear and loss. It's often an egoic, a trait of the ego, because if you are part of a totality that can never be lost, can never be harmed in that sense, in the truest sense, there is no fear there. What is there to fear? Fear exists when there's fearing something else, whether a thought or a concept. It exists in the form state, in the world of form, but in the formless. And this is something you can directly experience. Often I wake up, and I may wake up in an unconscious state of mind. The night before I may have gone to bed, perhaps focusing on my breathing and following my breathing as I slip into sleep. But when I wake up, there's thoughts of all the things I have to do today, and then maybe fear arises out of that. I don't want to do that, or I don't want to face this. And it shows how quickly it can be covered up, and how powerful thoughts can be. But then there's a moment when suddenly all of that fear falls away. And that moment may just simply be putting my feet on the floor and just being with the grounding of that feeling. And suddenly you've returned to the present moment. I'm not in a place where I'm overlooking it and I'm already thinking about this afternoon, about this and that, and generating emotions from those thoughts. I'm immediately, I'm missing out on the now. And you can almost look at thoughts as almost like a highway. If you look at any, freeway, motorway, highway, there's always traffic flowing. With the mind, there's always thoughts flowing. And if you grab onto one, you're on the highway then. On the thought highway of one thought and another thought and emotions, and sometimes it's difficult to get off of that. It's got a trajectory, it's got a momentum to it. Especially fearful thoughts as well. You've got to resolve that in your mind, or we've got to try to soothe it using your mind, which it may work temporarily. Or for me, it doesn't often work very well at all. So going back to that incident of somebody shouting that across the road, what can you do? It just is. Doesn't feel like there's an action needed to be taken. They're getting on the bus and they're going to go about their life. Maybe if they were racially abusing somebody else as I was walking, I can't predict, but maybe in that moment there'll be a call to action. Maybe there won't be. There isn't a right or wrong to that. But in that moment, they said what they said and got on the bus and they were gone. Okay, that's... For a moment I was a little bit shaken, or there was some thought activity around that of, why did they say that and how should I be reacting to this, and then eventually those subsided. And I don't remember what they looked like per se, but if I did and I saw them again, perhaps there may be some caution, but there wouldn't be maybe any emotional residue to what they said before. I haven't kept that alive in the mind. That person said this, and if we can often do that, keep it alive. We play the scenario over, we almost keep the heat under it. So when we see that person again, there's an explosion of reaction, usually unconscious reaction. It's been building up all of that time. But that's not been the case here. If I did remember their face, I would perhaps approach them with caution, and maybe I'd increase my consciousness. If they were to say something again, then perhaps it would be less effective, even more so now. But that seemed to come up in my awareness, so I thought I would share. And talk about the challenges of life. They can come big or small, big events, small events. And it's all there to almost serve us, to help us, rather than connecting to the ego and asking, why is life so unfair to me? What have I done to deserve this? It's just a chance to go deeper. So I thought I would read a quote from just going onto my Instagram account, and I often use social media to follow spiritual accounts. I'm not already one for scrolling through social media on a regular basis with different types of accounts. I've kind of using it as a power for good in some ways. So whenever I do want to do that, or perhaps I need a little bit of a boost or some realigning, I can just log on and read a tweet by a spiritual account or an Instagram post. And there was one by Deepak Chopra. There's a quote by him I read this morning where I wanted to perhaps share that before we begin continuing the power of now. It's a relatively short quote, just a few sentences. Space begins when we identify with a body. Time begins when we identify with the mind. Causality begins when we apply limitations. And I won't go into detail about this quote. I can leave that with you to reflect, but the line that did stand out for me was, time begins when we identify with the mind. And it's something that can be overlooked quite easily. And something, of course, the mind itself is blind to as well. And we can almost look at the simplicity of it, past and future. And we slip into it with ease. And as we continue down this process, we almost learn how deep the condition is to look to the past or to look to the future, and missing the now. And there are actually various tools people use. I think there's a watch that has now with each hour, or there's perhaps reminders you can get to be present. There's apps nowadays where I think a bell goes off every interval of time, whatever you set it as, and that bell is to remind you of the now. Of course, there's meditation apps and virtual timers you can use. So it's, just going back to my example of how I use social media, it's, we can, nothing in a sense like that is bad in itself. Sometimes we can label that as, that's something we need to stay away from, and it may be true for you. It may be thinking, okay, am I unable to use this in a conscious way, or by using this it brings too much unconscious up. So, it's good to look at your own self and tailor these things to what helps. Okay, so let's continue the reading of the Power of Now. Okay, and perhaps we can use this brief moment of silence just to focus on the present moment, where let's locate where we are. Okay, so toward a different order of reality. Question: I don't agree that the body needs to die. I am convinced that we can achieve physical immortality. We believe in death, and that's why the body dies. So perhaps it's more of a statement from the reader, and this is the reply. The body does not die because you believe in death. The body exists, or seems to, because you believe in death. Body and death are part of the same illusion, created by the egoic mode of consciousness, which has no awareness of the source of life and sees itself as separate and constantly under threat. So it creates the illusion that you are a body, a dense, physical vehicle that is constantly under threat. To perceive yourself as a vulnerable body that was born and a little later dies, that's the illusion. Body and death, one illusion. You cannot have one without the other. You want to keep one side of the illusion and get rid of the other, but that is impossible. Either you keep all of it or you relinquish all of it. However, you cannot escape from the body, nor do you have to. The body is an incredible misperception of your true nature. But your true nature is concealed somewhere within that illusion, not outside it. So the body is still the only point of access to it. If you saw an angel but mistook it for a stone statue, all you would have to do is adjust your vision and look more closely at the stone statue, not start looking somewhere else. You would then find that there never was a stone statue. Question: if belief in death creates the body, why does an animal have a body? An animal doesn't have an ego and it doesn't believe in death. Answer: but it still dies, or seems to. Remember that your perception of the world is a reflection of your state of consciousness. You are not separate from it, and there is no objective world out there. Every moment, your consciousness creates the world that you inhabit. One of the greatest insights that has come out of modern physics is that of the unity between the observer and the observed. The person conducting the experiment, the observing consciousness, cannot be separated from the observed phenomena. And a different way of looking causes the observed phenomena to behave differently. If you believe on a deep level in separation and the struggle for survival, then you see that belief reflected all around you, and your perceptions are governed by fear. You inhabit a world of death and of bodies fighting, killing, and devouring each other. Nothing is what it seems to be. The world that you create and see through the egoic mind may seem a very imperfect place, even a vale of tears. But whatever you perceive is only a kind of symbol, like an image in a dream. It is how your consciousness interprets and interacts with the molecular energy dance of the universe. This energy is the raw material of so-called physical reality. You see it in terms of bodies and birth and death, or as a struggle for survival. An infinite number of completely different interpretations, completely different worlds, is possible and in fact exists, all depending on the perceiving consciousness. Every being is a focal point of consciousness, and every such focal point creates its own world, although those worlds are interconnected. There is a human world, an ant world, a dolphin world, and so on. There are countless beings whose consciousness frequency is so different from yours that you are probably unaware of their existence as they are of yours. highly conscious beings who are aware of their connectedness with the Source and with each other would inhabit a world that to you would appear as a heavenly realm, and yet all worlds are ultimately one. Our collective human world is largely created through the level of consciousness we call mind. Even within the collective human world, there are vast differences, many different sub-worlds, depending on the perceivers or creators of their respective worlds. Since all worlds are interconnected, when collective human consciousness becomes transformed, nature and the animal kingdom will reflect that transformation. Hence, the statement in the Bible that in the coming age, the lion shall lie down with the lamb. This points to the possibility of a completely different order of reality. The world as it appears to us now is, as I said, largely a reflection of the egoic mind. Fear being an unavoidable consequence of egoic delusion, it is a world dominated by fear. Just as the images in a dream are symbols of inner states and feelings, so our collective reality is largely a symbolic expression of fear and of the heavy layers of negativity that have accumulated in the collective human psyche. We are not separate from our world, so when the majority of humans become free of egoic delusion, the inner change will affect all of creation. You will literally inhabit a new world. It is a shift in planetary consciousness. The strange Buddhist saying that every tree and every blade of grass will eventually become enlightened points to the same truth. According to St. Paul, the whole of creation is waiting for humans to become enlightened. That is how I interpret his saying, that the created universe is waiting with eager expectation for God's sons to be revealed. St. Paul goes on to say that all of creation will become redeemed through this. Up to the present, the whole created universe in all its parts groans as if in the pangs of childbirth. What is being born is a new consciousness and, as its inevitable reflection, a new world. This is also foretold in the New Testament book of Revelation. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. But don't confuse cause and effect. Your primary task is not to seek salvation through creating a better world, but to awaken out of identification with form. You are then no longer bound to this world, this level of reality. You can feel your roots in the unmanifested and so are free of attachment to the manifested world. You can still enjoy the passing pleasures of this world, but there is no fear of loss anymore, so you don't need to cling to them. Although you can enjoy sensory pleasures, the craving for sensory experience is gone, as is the constant search for fulfillment through psychological gratification, through feeding the ego. You are in touch with something infinitely greater than any pleasure, greater than any manifested thing. In a way, you then don't need the world anymore. You don't even need it to be different from the way it is. It is only at this point that you begin to make a real contribution toward bringing a better world, toward creating a different order of reality. It is only at this point that you are able to feel true compassion and to help others at the level of cause. Only those who have transcended the world can bring about a better world. You may remember that we talked about the dual nature of true compassion, which is awareness of a common bond, of shared mortality and immortality. At this deep level, compassion becomes healing in the widest sense. In that state, your healing influence is primarily based not on doing, but on being. Everybody you come in contact with will be touched by your presence and affected by the peace that you emanate, whether they are conscious of it or not. When you are fully present and people around you manifest unconscious behavior, you won't feel the need to react to it, so you don't give it any reality. Your peace is so vast and deep that anything that is not peace disappears into it as if it had never existed. This breaks the karmic cycle of action and reaction. Animals, trees, flowers will feel your peace and respond to it. You teach through being, through demonstrating the peace of God. You become the light of the world, an emanation of pure consciousness, and so you eliminate suffering on the level of cause. You eliminate unconsciousness from the world. And here we reach the pause and reflect symbol. So the first part of this section, I find it a little bit difficult to process, but there was some understanding to it as well. So I think what was being said here is that, the multiple worlds seen here, or the multiple realities, was based on mind. Almost, it's like everyone has their own little world called their mind. And to those people who are, highly conscious, Eckhart is saying, the world can seem heavenly to them. And he mentioned that largely the current reality of the world is fear-based, which is connected to largely, most of the population identified with ego, with their mind-made self. So I'm just going to scroll through some of these pages and pick out some lines just to, just to help with my own understanding, and perhaps that may help yours as well. And it feels a bit strange to read some quotes from the Bible, because it's part of my mind is perhaps got an old reaction to some different quotes from different religions. Sometimes there's a sense that perhaps it's a sense that if someone was to listen to this, they'll think, oh, this is all about the Bible, because Eckhart does quote it more regularly than some Buddhist quotes. But I believe Eckhart is just using the quotes to help with the understanding of the present moment, And I believe that these translations he's doing are, I guess they seem rare. And maybe my old reactions to Bible quotes are from people trying to convert me to that way of thinking, or they've maybe perhaps got their own understanding of certain verses, and maybe there's an agenda behind it when they're saying it. So maybe that's perhaps the old reaction while reading this. Maybe you see that there's a reaction in hearing them. Maybe something just to be aware of where that comes from. So just to touch upon what we've just read, it says, the world as it appears to us now is, as I said, largely a reflection of the egoic mind. And it says here, fear is an unavoidable consequence of egoic delusion. So if you're identified with mind, it's just a matter of time before the delusion of fear will come, of a loss of, something being taken, or fear of another person. And perhaps we can go back to, the start of the audio today, of, talk about racism. A lot of that is fear-based. And perhaps we can see this fear and these heavy layers of negativity, as Eckhart writes here. And this is the accumulation of the human psyche, and I can relate to that a lot. It's not to say there's lots of, perhaps you can, see it in various social media, in politics, around the world, these heavy layers of negativity. And it's all on the surface. You can almost feel that surface of negativity. And there's examples when you can see, through that. Perhaps there's, some person out there in maybe in a public space, or you may know personally who does, what you can call noble deeds or good things, but then on the surface there's still unconsciousness there that you may not like, or you may not connect with. But then you can see, deep down that person's, you can see that essence still trying to come up, through their actions. And maybe there's a conversation you have with them and you think, God, why can't all conversations with them be this pleasant or this nice? And then maybe next time you talk to them, there's lots of anger or unconsciousness come up, and maybe that's their own transition happening there. But Eckhart is saying the current state of human psyche, and he often refers to the 20th century of how much destruction there was, especially with humans, destroying other humans. All of that human psyche, and that's the current state of it at the moment. And Eckhart's saying the change that happens for the world, it's almost, it will happen holistically. And he uses the notion when you use the notion where your task is not to seek salvation and to seek to create change. It's to lose the identification to the mind. Just to read the exact sentence here. Your primary task is not to seek salvation through creating a better world, but to awaken out of identification with form. Because that's almost a byproduct of that. When you are that light that Eckhart talks about, when you interact and speak to people, that's all you are, so that's going to be emanated toward them. If it's the other way round, where you're trying to seek salvation through creating a better world, I can imagine a mind getting involved there. It seems like it's an unstable place. You're trying to get something to, there's almost a condition set on seeking something, that this has to change before you can get salvation. There needs to be a better world. But this is, talking about uncovering who you are. And those are two very different places to be. And it says here that you feel your roots in the unmanifested, so you are free of attachment to the manifested world. See, perhaps if we were using our mind, maybe the mind would say, okay, I need to, make a change in this world. And there's almost a seeking there. But if there's no underlying layer of consciousness, then you can imagine the instability there, that there's no roots to it. It can be quite easy to lose your way. But if you have, worked on yourself first, where you are, you've become what your desire is to create that change. And it's almost it reminds me of the law of manifestation, that you're not doing it out of need. You need something to happen, but you're doing it from a place of wholeness, a place of totality, where you are everything you want and need. You have this already in this one moment. It says here that although you can enjoy sensory pleasures, the craving for sensory experience is gone. So you're not chasing after something, and you're not, you can even something as noble as creating a better world. If it's done out of a place of need, okay, this needs to happen, but there's no roots to it. When you realise that you can enjoy the world as it is, that's not to say it will always remain that way, but you're not reliant on the world to make you happy, to help you with your, it's a condition to your spiritual progress, that the world needs to be in a certain condition, then I can elevate. And so when you've gone through this, your own spiritual progress, your journey, your path, it says you are in touch with something infinitely greater than any pleasure, greater than any manifested thing. And it says, in a way, you don't need the world anymore. And there's the key word there, is need. You don't even need it to be different from the way it is. And it is only at this point you can begin to make a real contribution for a better world. So it's only when you reach the place of fulfillment, true fulfillment, it's almost as if you feel, you can just imagine a bright light, it may seem, we hear it in a very flippant manner, but in a true sense, where you're just complete consciousness, you're connected, then when you do interact with people, if that's who you are, what's going to emanate from you, what's going to come out of your mouth, the actions you're going to take. If you are connected to that source, it's going to be that pure, aligned, universal action that's needed. Versus using, the mind as almost like a radar to think, okay, perhaps I need to do this to create this circumstance, or I need to do that to create this. And it's a very limited space that's heavily conditioned. So I hope that's brought a little bit more clarity there with that. It's just simply my own understanding of this. So it's by no means to take, my interpretations or my understanding literally. It's just my thinking out loud, my interpretation out loud. So perhaps I'll read until the end of the chapter, so several more pages, and then perhaps we can leave after that. But so Eckhart continues with this narrative. This doesn't mean that you may not also teach through doing. For example, by pointing out how to disidentify from the mind, recognize unconscious patterns within oneself, and so on. But who you are is always a more vital teaching and a more powerful transformer of the world than what you say, and more essential even than what you do. Furthermore, to recognize the primacy of being, not sure if that's pronounced primacy or primacy, the primacy of being, and thus work on the level of cause, does not exclude the possibility that your compassion may simultaneously manifest on the level of doing and of effect by alleviating suffering whenever you come across it. I'll just read that one again, maybe just to make that a bit more clearer. Furthermore, to recognize the primacy of being and thus work on the level of cause does not exclude the possibility that your compassion may simultaneously manifest on the level of doing and of effect by alleviating suffering whenever you come across it. When a hungry person asks you for bread and you have some, you will give it. But as you give the bread, even though your interaction may only be very brief, what really matters is this moment of shared being, of which the bread is only a symbol. A deep healing takes place within it. In that moment, there is no giver, no receiver. Question: but there shouldn't be any hunger and starvation in the first place. How can we create a better world without tackling evils such as hunger and violence first? Answer: all evils are the effect of unconsciousness. You can alleviate the effects of unconsciousness, but you cannot eliminate them unless you eliminate their cause. True change happens within, not without. If you feel called upon to alleviate suffering in the world, that is a very noble thing to do. But remember not to focus exclusively on the outer, otherwise you will encounter frustration and despair. Without a profound change in human consciousness, the world's suffering is a bottomless pit. So don't let your compassion become one-sided. Empathy with someone else's pain or lack and a desire to help need to be balanced with a deeper realization of the eternal nature of all life and the ultimate illusion of all pain. Then let your peace flow into whatever you do, and you will be working on the levels of effect and cause simultaneously. This also applies if you are supporting a movement designed to stop deeply unconscious humans from destroying themselves, each other, and the planet, or from continuing to inflict dreadful suffering on other sentient beings. Remember, just as you cannot fight the darkness, so you cannot fight unconsciousness. If you try to do so, the polar opposites will become strengthened and more deeply entrenched. You will become identified with one of the polarities. You will create an enemy and so be drawn into unconsciousness yourself. Raise awareness by disseminating information, or at the most, practice passive resistance. But make sure that you carry no resistance within, no hatred, no negativity. Love your enemies, said Jesus, which of course means have no enemies. Once you get involved in working on the level of effect, it is all too easy to lose yourself in it. Stay alert and very, very present. The causal level needs to remain your primary focus, the teaching of enlightenment, your main purpose, and peace, your most precious gift to the world. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 9. And it feels like as the chapter went on, it kind of clarified the earlier, text about different worlds and perhaps working on yourself first, or perhaps not first, but your primary task is making your connection to becoming conscious. Yeah, and there's some important points, especially for those who may currently be involved in charities or organizations where you are, trying to make an impact against those who are creating suffering on, as Eckhart says, other beings or other sentient beings. And it's a great point to remember what Eckhart says here, that you cannot fight the darkness, you cannot fight unconsciousness. And by doing that, you've created that polar opposites, from the oneness to the one totality, the one being of all the beings collected together. We've created a polarity. So I'm going to leave it there without too much more explanation. And, feel free to comment on I don't think you can comment on the podcast, but on my YouTube page you can. If you have any of your own interpretations or points or questions, and, even perhaps a clearer explanation of what's been read, then, I definitely invite you to share that with others, and we can all help each other as we take this journey together, this path. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, so thanks for joining me for today's episode. I wish you well, as always, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Take care.